Thank you very much to Deloitte for sponsoring this particular event for ACEDS, e-discovery in a post-COVID world. We have a number of people that signed up for this particular opportunity, and I know that there was some timing issues, so we are recording it so that the people who are, probably getting this an hour from now can actually tune in and listen to the presentation. I'm going to do quick housekeeping. If you're not on mute and if you've called in, please ensure that you are on mute so that we can listen to the presenters and we have no feedback. I'm going to put myself on mute because I have jackhammering in my backyard. So that's going to be really quick for me. And I'm going to turn it over to Lisa to introduce our panel.
Thanks, Monique. Hi, I'm Lisa Rennie, and I'd like to thank you for joining us today. I'm going to introduce the rest of our panel, which is Jasmine Lamb, who's a law clerk and e-discovery specialist at Singleton Urquhart Reynolds Vogel. Tim Choi, who's a manager with the Discovery Group of Deloitte, and Peter Samford, who is a director with the Discovery Group of Deloitte as well. Thank you for joining us today. Sorry about the timing mix-up. Peter, Tim, and Jasmine, did you want to add anything to your intro, or should we just move forward?
So maybe in the interest of time, let's get chatting.
Let's get chatting. Okay, we thought it was a timely. It was good timing to talk about some of our experiences during COVID and now as we move through what we hope is sort of our post-COVID situation. So we thought we would start by talking about a rapid shift to remote working and some of the experiences we've had there and what we're seeing now. So let me just put it out there. What has your experience been, both on the law firm side and the service provider side, both working remotely and now with the hybrid or return to office situation? And I know that people are in different situations, and sometimes different parts of the country seem to dictate how much people are in the office these days and how much they're working remotely. But let's start with you, perhaps Jasmine and Tim.
Hi. So I am based out of Toronto, and the rest of my firm, we have a Vancouver office as well. I know the back to office uptake has been a bit higher than those in the Toronto office. So we are still, for the most part, working remotely. And I think that we transitioned into work from home very quickly. Like our office, which admittedly is not huge, we were about 25 people at the outset of COVID. And we transitioned basically over the course of 48 hours. And we all went home for 2 days. And here we are now. And I think the going backwards now is a bit more of a challenge, because I think we've all settled into a new routine and we're all sort of online more than ever. We are very adaptable beings. And I think that poses some challenges for return to office. How about you, Tim?
Yeah, I think from our side, we definitely kind of saw the similar thing. It was a bit harder for us to transition into this COVID world because we did a lot with like servers and in person. So it was a little harder for us to create these processes to make sure that we could access everything we needed to without prior warning. Pretty much overnight, everyone had to stop being in the office. So it was we definitely had to evaluate things on the fly. Getting back into the office, I think I agree that a lot of people and the processes that we've created kind of have stuck, and we're continuing with what we've learned so that we can give people the time to work remotely a bit more, so that we don't need everybody in the office all the time and to do everything that they need to do.
I think pivot was a big buzzword for 2020. So you're talking about pivoting well, I think. Peter, what kind of impact do you think the shift to working remotely has had with respect to potential data sources and volumes of data we're seeing in e-discovery right now?
Yeah, so I think one thing that I noticed very quickly, and certainly in the files that we're seeing kind of come across our desks now, having kind of 2 years of work product generated over COVID, is a large increase in volume of information. and also new sources of data where organizations have adapted to working from home or working in a virtual environment. The biggest impacts that we're seeing, as you see on the slide here, is a big increase in email traffic. And not just email traffic, but communication traffic in general. A lot of meetings that would happen in person have been replaced by virtual meetings or would be kind of in collaborative platforms like Team and Slack, which we'll speak about a little bit later in the presentation and discussion. And then just a lot of version control as well. So people working on work product going back and forth while they're trying to manage working in a virtual environment. So that's been a big shift that we've seen in terms of the data that's been generated over the last 24 months. And as we, Lisa, to pick up on your buzzword, kind of pivot back to our, what at Deloitte we're calling the next normal of a hybrid working environment, we expect to see some of those trends continue.
What do you think that the impact of COVID has had on the practice of law sort of generally?
I think something that we'll touch on a little later, I think, is the subject matter of the practice of law. So I think COVID has had some very sweeping effect on the issues that have come up on various, contract matters and litigation matters and whatnot. But in terms of just working together in a law firm environment, I think the increase in traffic in using tools like Teams and Slack has made smaller communication a lot easier and much more voluminous. But that makes it a little bit harder to track when you think about your traditional law firm model, where ideally emails are filed and can be searched. That makes it a bit harder when the day-to-day communications have shifted to a different platform that isn't quite so file management friendly. It makes it harder for parties who are not involved in the one-on-one chats to stay in the loop. So I think that kind of throws a wrench into some of the project management side of complex matters, which you have.
You're right. When we're working remotely, you don't pick up on the office chatter and the sort of group communication that happens in an informal setting sometimes.
And you're just not privy to the kind of innocuous almost chatter. It's almost like suddenly you're sitting next to everyone. Everyone is next to you in a cubicle. When before, you'd have to, I sit at my office, I sit right outside of the kitchen. To get to the coffee, you have to see me. So I know who is talking to everybody at all times. But now it's like everyone is just in front of their two screens, and
you're probably still right outside of your kitchen.
It's right there.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's talk about new e-discovery data sources, because that's been mentioned, and I think that's a big piece of what we're looking at now that's different from anything we've managed before. So how have you seen the types of client data evolve over the past 2 years? I mean, are we seeing less email, more instant messaging, more email, more instant messaging? And is there a noticeable difference when it comes to the type and enterprise or business of the clients that we service and the size of the client? Are you seeing, for example, larger clients with more formal email communications and less instant messaging, or vice versa? Maybe Tim, I know you've been involved with a number of collections. Maybe you can speak to this.
Yeah, so I think there's definitely been an uptick in the amount of mobile collections and mobile data being asked to be preserved. It used to be kind of more mobile data was tended to the photos and more tangible documents that you could look at, but now everybody's sort of texting others, WhatsApps between them, that there's conversations there, that they're now seeing that this is actually a really important data source. And the more I've noticed that pretty much on every investigation, the mobile phones, the text messages, the WhatsApps want to be reviewed, and lawyers are keeping more of an eye on what can be gathered from that and what information can be used. In terms of like notable difference in types of enterprise and size of clients, like the big companies, the two big companies, Google, Microsoft, everybody seems to be tending towards them. So even your smaller firms are now starting to either use them because of the subscription models. So either like some will have like Google Hangouts and G Suites, which weren't hugely popular maybe 2 or 3 years ago. Only some maybe boutique firms might be using it, but now actually some larger firms are using it now too. And then obviously Microsoft has always been a big player, but firms are definitely being more savvy or aware of their data, and wherever, as everyone's aware, in different places, excuse me, everyone's working remotely, so they're trying to make efforts to kind of centralize it, or at least get it so that it can be monitored through like a central repository.
Mm. And what kinds of challenges and perhaps successes have you seen or encountered when it comes to collecting from platforms that are, you know, Slack and Teams and the sort of collaborative places that we're speaking now?
So in terms of collections for these, it changes so quickly. So sometimes it can take you by surprise. That's one of the challenges that we found. For example, like Teams data is one of the ways you collect it is through O365 preservations. And that used to come out as part of the PST data. But recently, and actually quite suddenly, they changed it to a different format. So we had to pivot again and kind of innovate in-house and evaluate new tools to make sure that we can still utilize this data. Yeah, that's one of the challenges we've definitely found.
And I've come across the same thing that Tim has mentioned is, you know, as on one side of a matter, our client has their in-house IT department who has run their collection, some of which is sort of not within our control all the time, especially working remotely when we're not meeting with clients all the time. You know, you send emails and suddenly you don't really know how expanded the team got on the client side because they have to get hands-on. And so they would have collected the team's data in one way, which doesn't quite match up with how opposing party has collected their data. And so we kind of need to sort out how the two can talk to each other if we are submitting our productions to then a third party, and they need to be able to read everything together. That kind of presented a little bit of a challenge, which actually we don't really know the outcome of yet because we haven't heard much feedback from the third party. So it's certainly kind of new territory still, especially if you're not litigating all the time, because our firm is specialized in infrastructure and construction, and so most of our projects go through arbitration, mediation, some form of dispute resolution, which doesn't necessarily require as thorough collection as say rules of procedure. So it doesn't come up all the time, but it's certainly kind of on the uptick.
Are there any of the platforms that are particularly onerous or hard to collect from to manage? Tim, have you come across something that you think is, you know, a client contacts you and you go, oh no, not that?
I mean, some of them, a bit like Slack, is a little complicated because you have to base it off the API and then you have to work off their subscription level. So we've noticed that depending on the subscription level, even with Microsoft, they may be able to get some things, they may not be able to get some other things. So yeah, they all have some challenges depending on like also the savviness of the IT and experience with it. But Slack, the API has to be connected to it for you to get access to it. Same with some social media accounts like Twitter or so trying to connect to those correct systems and getting the permissions to actually connect to their Slack enterprise has been sometimes quite a bit challenging.
Tim, I want to jump in here too on your comment around subscriptions, and this was exemplified this week on a number of matters that we're working on in Vancouver. Same partner, different associates on the file, but different clients, and really different outcomes in terms of collection strategy based on the kind of maturity curve of the company. And essentially their O365 subscription. So the ability to collect Teams data from one company is completely different than the ability to collect from the other company on, you know, again, two matters that have kicked off within the same week, but really different collection strategies based on the maturity of the organization that we're supporting.
That's really interesting. Let's ask Peter and Tim, how have you managed to come up with ways to present and review the data from these sources? Is that, I mean, I'm guessing that it's different from the typical situation.
Yeah, so presenting it is also like, again, it's been a theme, it's a bit of a challenge and kind of new. So we had two different clients. One client wanted every message in a chat chain from a mobile text and Teams chat as individual documents. So they did not have to produce like some of the chains, but they were really long. They didn't have to produce the immaterial documents. Whereas another was happy to have it as one long chain in one document as one long message. So it's kind of getting a consensus with what they want to produce and then understanding how to best present it so they can be efficient in reviewing it and also not over producing it as well.
Right.
And I think they're going back to kind of the initial conversation we're having around what data is getting produced in COVID that wasn't getting produced before. Is a lot of these are replacements for in-person interactions. These are text message chains regulating the price of a commodity. These are organizations discussing their legal strategy based on a claim, all of which may be handled in a kind of more informal setting before COVID, but now because of COVID, because of the need to work virtually, these are kind of those new challenges showing up. And we'll speak about it a little later on in the discussion, but part of the calculus, as Tim has been alluding to in terms of presenting the material appropriately, is what's the level of effort that goes into presenting this data in a way that makes sense for the review team, in a way that the other party or a regulator may want to receive this information in, and what's kind of the cost benefit of that. So to make that really clear, one file we had, there was an ask to split messages on a daily basis to make it easier for the review team to handle. And Relativity, as an example, has a short message format that allows you to build a text chain or a chat conversation in a way that it would appear kind of on your iPhone. But the level of effort required to split that data appropriately means a lot of upfront effort on the discovery provider in exchange for ease of review for the review team later on. So that's a consideration as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's talk for a minute about some of the logistical challenges that we're encountering and have encountered over COVID. I know for me personally, when I've been dealing with clients who are not in the office at all, it makes, receiving a USB or a portable drive with data next to impossible. And so I'm seeing massive amounts of data being transferred through SFTP sites and other sort of tools that we used before, but not as much as we do now. So, what are your thoughts, panel, on some of the logistics, the permissions, the collection, the production, that type of thing? Okay. Jasmine, are you seeing issues with your clients and, or not issues, but, are you doing things in a different way with receiving data from your clients or managing it?
So when we transitioned to working from home, so did many of our clients. And I think that while we are very adaptable beings, there are things that sort of didn't get considered in the kind of flash change of moving to a home office. And one of those things I found was working from a home internet. We are all kind of used to operating out of big office towers, and internet speed was never really an issue, even though some of us transfer really big chunks of data day in, day out. And what we ended up, not so much near, past the first 6-month mark, but the first 6 months were not easy, both from just working, doing my day-to-day tasks, having to move around data just without even interacting with clients, but then also having to receive data from clients who are suddenly mailing and couriering USB keys to my home or driving them to my apartment because it was just faster than to try to upload X number of gigabytes with her own home internet. So those are certainly things that we had to kind of try by fire and resolve. And, you know, over the course of the past year and two, we have somewhat successfully transitioned to mostly cloud-based file sharing, which, you know, comes with still its own issues. I mean, but I think by now most people have managed to upgrade their internet to accommodate for their work needs. And you know, there's privacy and security issues associated with using cloud-based services. You know, there are clients who are very sensitive to putting things in the cloud versus just sticking it on a USB key and mailing it. There are all kinds of things that we have to consider. But I think we have come a long way in terms of making it work with things like Box and ShareFile and other services like that.
Yeah. And Tim and Peter, have you experienced any sort of crazy logistical situations? And Tim, I know that you have done some pretty remote collections, even during COVID, where there was no option but to do it in person. So maybe the two of you can share a little bit about what you've dealt with in the last couple of years with that, and if you've come up with any new great options or things that you've put into practice for daily use now.
So in terms of the collections, yeah, there was a fair few because these sort of events still require a person on site. We had an interesting one that some clients utilized was actually just putting like a COC alongside a device inside like a secure locker that they had access to, gave us the code, we would take the device from there sometimes. And really it was trying to find, and the logistical sorting of it was the most challenging point. So you had to go through a fair few number of loopholes or trying to get sign off from a lot of people before you could even rent the car to get anywhere. And that was difficult. Going on site into a client office, you literally didn't see anyone, so that was okay, but most places wasn't open. So
getting someone to open the door for you was probably the first logistical issue.
Exactly. Trying to actually get to the place to actually collect the data always seemed difficult because nobody wanted you to come near, or they wanted to try and figure out if they could just leave it somewhere where you could just collect it and do it. In terms of like in person for our office, we've been really trying to figure out how to get people into the office without affecting others, because we still would obviously get these large hard drives with data on it. Somebody would still have to plug it into our servers, and trying to logistically figure out who would go in and who was willing to go in was quite challenging.
Yeah, I think, Tim, to build on that, you know, we're a large professional services organization, we try to be nimble and move fast, but we also add in a lot of layers of kind of security and protocol to make sure that our people are safe. It's required a lot of flexibility and problem solving on our team's part, which I think has given some of our more junior team members a lot more rope in terms of their mandate and kind of ability to serve on projects, because the leaders of our practice don't have all the answers. Really, everybody on this call and everybody listening in as well have kind of been doing the best with what they've known for the past 2 years, and we're making, you know, the best decisions we can with the information we've got. You see on the slide here that like we had to work through obviously the safety protocols associated with COVID, and I think Tim's made a really good point here around employee comfort. How do you manage teams to respect their safety concerns and considerations while working in, you know, a highly reactive service? And that's been kind of the balancing act that as a service provider, we've spent a lot of time trying to get right. Sometimes we've not got it all that well, and sometimes I think we've done a really good job of managing it appropriately. As Tim mentioned, there's been a lot of there's been a really big uptick in terms of need for collection on site for individual reasons. Sometimes that's because employers themselves aren't interested in having their teams on site, and so they're looking for a third party to come on site to be the ones to manage that collection. And so that's something that, again, we've done our best to work through, and we're noticing a little bit more of a normalization in terms of working with IT services and IT departments to be able to gain access to data again, though there are still a number of kind of comfort level protocols that individual organizations still have in place, and as service providers we need to be really respectful of those as well.
And do you find that law firms and clients are able to manage infrastructure challenges like shortage of server space, for instance, faster and more readily than they did pre-COVID? I know I'm seeing that in our office, that where we might have needed to add server space to our relativity server, and it was a case of putting it pressed into IT, and then we get it a few days later, a week later, it's like sometimes an hour later we've got what we need, and we just keep going. And I do find that things seem to be a little easier and faster, both of those. So, well, what's your experience with that?
I think in our experience at my firm, it's just been a little more nimble in terms of choosing one route versus the other, in terms of putting things in relativity or hosting everything on a server, because our alternatives are to either use a vendor or to host it in-house. And in the past, I think we are less quick to make decisions to host in a database. And I mean, during COVID, there certainly, with the influx of so much data, we still had to increase server space. And I feel like the turnaround was not hugely different from before, but I think we are a bit more nimble in our approach, which has made it easier on our IT and infrastructure.
So I would answer that question in a little bit of with a bit of a conflicting answer, in that we are also trying to stay nimble, but we're also trying to plan ahead a little bit more than we were before, because we don't have as many people in the office. We don't have the ability to kind of just spin up an additional server the way we would have before. And so we're trying to anticipate some of these large data volumes coming in, having those conversations with our IT teams earlier, rather than kind of, oh, it's the 11th hour, our client has dropped a new RAID drive with 5 terabytes of data that needs to go into the system. We're trying to build a bit more resiliency into our business ahead of time. But then, when the iron strikes, you do need to pivot pretty quickly, as Jasmine said as well.
Mm-hmm. What has your experience been in managing review teams and in project management and e-discovery workflow generally? How do you think that has changed and is changing?
I think that, during COVID, actually in the past, Peter would know, in the past 6 months or so, we've managed a pretty sizable review. And I think that having experienced COVID and working remotely entirely for 2 years prior to this mandate landing, was a great benefit, because we no longer are in the office all day together. However, like I mentioned before, having a tool like Teams and having a team that embraces using something like Teams has made the small interactions a lot easier. And I mean, it's not hard to create a group chat on Teams for your review team. And it actually allows for much easier and constant kind of small interactions with a team of, say, 6 reviewers, for us to share information, to share, oh, I found this, how about you? Oh, how do we tag this? Just ask questions rather than having to, I think in the in-office world, we would have had one-on-one conversations times 7. But now we're able to kind of all be in the same room at the same time, all the time in some ways. So I think that's a really positive takeaway from working remotely that we will continue to use, even if and when we all go back to the office, that there are some communications that are really helpful to manage using tools like Teams. It's just easier to collaborate than how we would traditionally have done it in person.
Mhm.
I think to add to that, Jasmine, I have felt like I am managing my teams the way that we just spoke about all those new sources of data being created. So on any given day, I'm sending messages through email, through text message, through Microsoft Teams, through phone calls, and a variety of other platforms. Like the constant in terms of managing teams virtually is communication. And one thing that we've done as a firm is to spend a bit more time being a bit more deliberate about which platforms we use to communicate with, so that we keep everybody on the same page. When you're in an office environment and you can walk over to somebody's desk and tap them on the shoulder and say, hey, we want to work this way, that's a really kind of efficient way of getting business done. As we're transitioning to a kind of, again, what Deloitte calls the next normal, we're going to have teams of people who decide and have dictated that they will work remotely for the remainder of their careers. And as a firm, we've taken the position that we want to create parity of opportunity for those people. So those who choose to work from home forever should have the same opportunities within the firm as those who want to be on site every day. And so the onus on managers and team leaders is to manage that communication a lot more effectively and be really deliberate about how we are creating parity in our communication strategies with teams.
Okay, that leads me to my next question then, which is, what do you think the impact of working remotely has had on training, database training, for instance, and review teams? I can see that there may be positives in that you could bring in people from other offices because you're working remotely, but you're not there one-on-one in person necessarily. So what kind of an impact are you seeing there?
Maybe I'll start. I think, oh, sorry, Tim, go ahead.
Yeah, so in terms of some work, it's a lot easier to do remotely, but then obviously things like collections, preservations, it's really a hands-on sort of demonstration, and it's been a little tough to onboard definitely some of the are like interns or new hires into this new process. We've had to think of new ways of trying to get them experience, or for them to shadow and get this experience in doing it the correct way and making sure that they are doing it the correct way, because you can't monitor them through a webcam particularly easily to make sure that they are solving these problems or have the necessarily correct experience there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think to build on that, Tim, a shop like ours is, in a lot of law firms as well, there's an apprenticeship model to it. And so if you're, back to kind of my earlier point, if you're not able to mentor and coach people in person, you need to be pretty careful about making time, building it into your schedule to manage those people virtually, so that you've got, the human connection, first of all, the kind of team culture that you're trying to generate, and then, as Tim mentioned, the actual hands-on work experience, and making sure that you're transferring those skills and that knowledge to other folks on your team. Jasmine, what's it been like at your firm?
Personally, if I was doing any sort of onboarding or training, usually it would be with either Relativity or some other database, some other platform. And I have found it actually easier to do training via a tool like Teams or Zoom, because you can share your screen and have a chat, and they can also click through it at the same time. And now this has happened both ways. Like sometimes I'm on the receiving end of this. And I think it's to kind of tie back to the benefit of having a hands-on element. It does allow for that you can see it and you can talk through it, have a conversation about it, and also click through it at the same time. So it kind of is like workshopping. And then, you know, you can have a call with the team that is you're kind of chatting with on a particular project, and then still maintain that stream of comments and tips and outcomes from your training call in the same chat. So in that case, I find that working remotely is sometimes, this was a more effective way to do training compared to in what I call the before times. In the before times, when we would sit in a boardroom and watch someone do a presentation on a screen, but not actually have anything in front of us, it was a little hard to absorb everything. So doing it on a call, I thought has been a pretty good way to do reviewer training or just standard on onboarding and technology training. So I think it's a good tool.
Jasmine,
I know that.
Sorry, go ahead, Lisa.
I was just going to say, I know that when I do training, the one thing I miss is being able to sort of look at the person and gauge that I'm going too fast or too slow, and they get that look in their eye like, okay, I don't understand any of this. And so when I do it through Teams, I always say, you know, stop me, don't hesitate to jump in, stop me if I'm going too fast, because I'm not looking at their face on the screen and the little tiny window. I'm looking at my relativity screen when I'm walking them through it and showing them some of our case dynamics. So that I miss that sort of being able to look at the person and size up the situation. But at the same time, it is really handy just to be able to say, oh, you know, you've been added to this file 10 minutes ago. Let's jump on a call and I'll walk you through the database and you'll be up and running this afternoon, kind of thing, rather than trying to schedule a one-on-one time in the same location. So that is a positive, I think, in a lot of ways. Have you seen any other positive changes or opportunities that have come from the hybrid model, just generally?
I think I will say that in COVID times, I actually have seen face-to-face, but remotely, I've seen some of my colleagues face-to-face more than I ever would if we were in the same office, because we're on opposite ends of the office. There's actually another coffee maker that I can't see. So some people can get caffeinated without walking past my desk. I just think it made it easier to connect with more people. I think most of us likely work in a situation where you work with, you know, all of your colleagues, but you invariably will work with a bubble of your colleagues more than most others. And I found that working remotely kind of leveled that out a bit. It was just so much easier to get FaceTime rather than resort to emails. And maybe it's because I'm a millennial, but I find it hard to track everything when it's not in email or in Teams. At least it's searchable. I mean, Teams is perhaps not perfect in terms of tracing back what you've discussed. Not quite as easy as emails, but I find it a bit challenging to deal with phone calls and a lot of even face-to-face meetings. Like, it's just, you lose track of things when it's not recorded or papered. Yeah,
true.
For our practice, and for I think anybody on attendees who are kind of in the e-discovery industry, one really big benefit I've noticed has been kind of an increased use case for e-discovery technology that sits outside of litigation and dispute resolution. We have, as a firm, spent a lot of time and thought into using tools like Relativity and Brainspace and Nuix for use cases beyond litigation and dispute resolution, whether it's supporting M&A activity, working in cyber breach and PII response, freedom of information and privacy. And what I would say, to Jasmine's point of kind of opening up the tent or having access to more people and creating more connections, scheduling a meeting with, you know, some of the senior partners at the firm who lead very different areas of practice is a lot easier than it used to be, because everybody is, well, not everybody, but many people are still spending a lot of their time from home. You can find some availability in their calendar. It's not that hard to strike up a conversation. Now, Tim, I know that you've been involved in some really fascinating work using e-discovery technology well outside kind of the dispute resolution space. talking about some of the claims admin work that we're doing. And I don't think we would have gotten the opportunity to work on something like that were it not for kind of the increased need for collaboration across platforms, the way that we're doing on this kind of call right now.
For broader use of e-discovery.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it comes firmly with the kind of the need to work from home, and then also the need for different areas of practice of law and of kind of just service providing to find new ways to collaborate and to use these types of technologies more effectively.
Mm-hmm. My final question for this panel is, what do you predict will be the next big disruption to litigation as we know it? We're not ready for it yet, but what do you think it will be?
So as we were preparing for this, I threw one out there, and maybe I'll be wrong. I think that the level of M&A activity that's happened over the last 18 months, as we've seen, this massive cash hoard by individuals and corporations, and then this really big spend and large deal activity is going to result in a lot of disputes in the next 5 years. I think right now we're experiencing kind of the beginning of the wave of COVID-related litigation, whether those are kind of force majeure events, construction delays, and things like that. I think the next thing we're going to be seeing is a lot of kind of M&A and shareholder dispute activity being disputed in the future. That's my crystal ball answer.
Working within the construction industry, I mirror Peter's comments that we're certainly seeing the beginning of a wave of force majeure related claims, and certainly supply interruptions. It was originally due to COVID, and now we have other political reasons that will trigger supply chain issues, and you have all sorts of notices being given for supply chain issues and delays. Everyone is trying to avoid liability and being on the hook for delays and costs and all that stuff. So on a smaller level, that's definitely my experience from the day to day. And on a kind of grander scheme, I'm not sure that this is such a prediction, because I think there's a lot of articles and literature being written on it. But I think privacy and cybersecurity is definitely an up and coming area that's going to be very prominent. I think that the amount of education and knowledge is definitely making its way to everybody, the general public, and the more people are aware of where their information is and like where it's going, where it's coming from, the more questions people are going to ask, and the more kind of discerning people will be with where your data is trafficked or sold, perhaps. And that will become, I think, a bit of an issue in the next little while.
Mm-hmm. Tim, what about you?
Yeah, I think I agree with those sentiments. I also believe we've noticed a lot more in already employment law with what they deemed as the Great Resignation, and people kind of trying to see what they can do post-COVID, during COVID, trying to reset their lifestyles to suit themselves. And that we've also noticed, obviously, as we go in digital, the sheer amount of data that's coming through. So we've definitely already had a fair few files this year where we're breaking records on the amount of data that we're trying to process through. And as we're kind of going forwards, I believe that will just keep increasing, and trying to figure what to do with it and how to really shift through it will become a prevalent question that we'll have to answer.
That's a good point, Tim. There's definitely cost pressures on service providers to lower our technology fees. What there has not been is any cost pressure in terms of our advice. A lot more clients are coming to us to ask for, okay, I've got 4 terabytes of data. How do I make sense of this? How do I make heads and tails of this? And how do I contain costs? And so that kind of advisory side of our business seems to be on the uptick big time. And it's something that we're spending more time educating our junior team members about, and kind of giving them the opportunity to apprentice on a lot of those, so that they've got answers for the next generation.
Mm-hmm. And to Tim's point about the sheer volume of data, my prediction is that we'll have many more e-discovery jobs being available, which is always a good thing. But I think that was great, panel. Do you have any other comments you'd like to add, or do we have any questions from the group in our last few minutes? I'm looking at the chat.
A couple of great comments in the chat about the new legislation, or the updates to legislation that will come into effect, will definitely raise the bar. You know, Canada has sort of been in the middle when it comes to privacy legislation, and stepping up to the bar of the GDPR, I think, will create a lot of work for companies to match the requirements of what to do with their data and how to keep it and dispose of it, et cetera, et cetera.
Mm-hmm. Any other comments, questions? Well, I'd like to say a huge thank you to our panel, to Jasmine, Tim, and Peter, and to Deloitte for sponsoring this meeting. We apologize for the technical difficulties at the beginning, but we made it through, and I appreciate everybody's attendance here.
Thanks very much for having us, Lisa. We really appreciate it.
Bye, everybody.